Yeah, so I really just had a simple point to make tonight on my live stream. I find it interesting that oftentimes both city, county, state, and the national government will exploit crime as an opportunity to punish through the imposition of fines as a means of generating government revenue, and how the potential for bias in the application of a fine as punishment is extreme because the government there's a bias there in applying the fine. There's the opportunity for the government to profit from the application of that fine as a punishment. And so, in the application of that form of punishment as a fine, there is the possibility that the government can exploit that crime through the infliction of a punishment which, if placed and raised to the right levels, could allow it to generate revenue and profit in the process, and how crime is often exploited to generate government revenue in the imposition of fines on crimes. And it's very interesting to me. I had an experience recently where there was street cleaning in my area, and my car was towed because I was on the wrong side of the street on the wrong day. And it just so happened to be the case that the procedure for that is to tow the car so that the street cleaners can actually, clean the street. And so the car was towed, and interestingly, I noticed it's very interesting how in the case that I just mentioned, often even accidental crimes will be exploited to generate revenue through the imposition of fines. And as I said, there are issues of bias there, and how it can be impartially decided what the proper fine is when the government has an explicit. Now, if the fine is set by the courts, that's supposed to be an unbiased institution, and so maybe the court could render a fine level that's appropriate. But again, courts apply law, and law is a political creation. So looking at the system in that way, fines, if they're created by representatives and the representative aspects of government, branches of government, then likely they're going to be the fine level, and the fine imposed is going to be an inherently biased fine in the sense that it is not graduated and proportional to the crime, but also raised to a level that allows the government to profit and generate revenue through the imposition of the fine. It's funny how even accidental crimes end up being exploited through the imposition of a mandatory fine, irrespective of whether the crime was intentional or accidental. And in many cases, crimes only end up being accidental, and so to impose the same fine, irrespective of circumstances, seems to be unavoidable, and that's part of having a fine. If we didn't apply the fine, then someone could invoke some particular circumstance in their situation, and that is itself spurious and untrue, and they could exploit if there are too many exceptions to a rule, then the rule ends up being very difficult to enforce. So that's the principle there, the legal logic that underpins the blind imposition of a fine. Now, with regard to, we don't just do this with minor petty fines for street violations. We do it. This isn't the only area in which crime is exploited to generate revenue through the imposition of fines. Crime is exploited to generate government revenue in other ways as well. With regard to, I'm not exactly sure how the prison industrial complex ties into this and whether that's the same thing. But it's particularly with fines that the government can, in a very biased and self-interested way, exploit either an intentional or accidental violation to impose a fine, and to, in doing so, impose it at a level that allows the government to profit in some way through the imposition of the fine. Seems to me to be a very uh, inappropriate mechanism of going about imposing a fine as a punishment. Now, certainly, the law, criminal law, and the imposition of punishment in the form of a fine is all about deterrence. So with street violations, we're trying to create deterrence against the violation through the imposition of a fine against the violation, through the imposition of some form of punishment. And if the fine is too low, well, then they'll just choose to pay the fine in certain situations where they could just engage in economic thinking and engage in a consideration of trade-offs where they could simply, well, just choose to pay a low fine instead of, right? That could end up being even economically beneficial to them. So they're, thinking about things economically. There are situations in which simply paying a fine and violating the law is perfectly economically viable. And so the fine has to be at a level where individuals are legitimately deterred from committing the violation. But there is a lot of wiggle room there where the state can, or the city government can certainly, skew that fine level, to their own benefit. And not so much in the interest of creating deterrence, but also in generating profit. I don't think that human decision makers are truly capable of overcoming that incentive there that being able to impose a fine justifiably offers them. So it ends up becoming a opportunity for them to just generate revenue, which is a. Now, my way of looking at this, my solution to the idea that the state should not be able to exploit crime to generate revenue in any way, because there's this potential for bias there with the imposition of any fine. The fine needs to be at a level that is impartially. The fine must be, in that sense, must be the creation of an impartial body, and must be graduated and put at a level that creates deterrence and effectively, irrespective of how the government might profit by the attempt to create deterrence in the form of the fine. So the courts should have, in this sense, courts often don't have an independent function. They simply apply the input that emanates from all of the other branches of government, and the courts simply apply the law. They don't seek, in the sense, it goes back to the question of, are judges supposed to, and the courts, do we go to the courts to seek justice, or do we go to the courts to seek mere application of law, irrespective of justice? And it's too idealistic to say that we go to the courts. It's just silly. It's a silly idealism to think that we go to the courts to seek justice specifically. But in any case, what ends up happening is we get just not justice, rather just an application of the law that is created by the other branches of government. Now, in this sense, my solution to so as to remove bias from the process of generating fines at appropriate levels is to give the courts an independent power to do so, where the courts, well, there's less interest in the courts there's less conflict of interest in the courts with respect to government revenue and whether the imposition of a fine could be increased, right, beneficially to increase government revenue. The courts really get their revenue either way. They have no real stake in whether the revenue reaches a certain level. They only indirectly, not in the same direct sense that representatives do. Courts are furnished with all that they need fiscally either way. So let the courts decide, being the unbiased branch of the less biased branch of government in this sense, not having concern with revenue and all of the realities of the representative branches of government, then the courts should be employed to perform the independent function of deciding what is a fine level that creates deterrence, but does not, in a biased way, simply uh, generate profit for the government. So the courts should be tasked with this independent function of being able to decide um, how fines should be imposed and at what levels without bias. Because if the government can exploit crime and the ability to implement and impose a punishment in the form of a fine to generate revenue for itself, we certainly wouldn't be able to trust human decision makers to avoid that bias and to be able to decide impartially what fine level creates deterrence in a balanced way and in a adequately effective way at no greater level than what is adequately necessary to create deterrence against the violation in the future. So that's my thinking on how the state can often exploit crime and use the opportunity to impose punishment to generate profit for itself, and how the administrators that have an interest in how the state might benefit from the imposition of a particular punishment and exploit crime thus, we need to think very critically about how we go about limiting the bias and the conflicts of interest that would ultimately lead to punishments that are not impartially constructed. In any case, the issue of fines and how we at what level we impose them and the specific price tag attached to each fine. It's a very important question, but in that area there is no greater, the possibility of bias is even greater. If the task of figuring out how to graduate fine levels is not, if that task is not properly institutionally located, right? So if we if we assign that task to the wrong institution or the wrong department, then we should expect that there would be differing amplitudes of bias or potential for bias in different departments and institutions. So we have to find to remove this problem of bias from crime being exploited to generate profit for the government. We have to ensure that we're assigning these tasks, these important decisioning tasks, to the proper branch, department, or institution, so that we can take into account the reality of the motives of the actors and the agents that operate within these institutions and systems, so that we can assign the task at the right point in that matrix of institutions and departments, and decide what department and what institution is most suited to rendering discretionary judgments on things that are in an unbiased way. And the courts, seem to be the best option for that. So tasking the courts with the independent task of then deciding what fine levels create deterrence, and what fine levels would exceed the utility of creating deterrence for the government's revenue benefit, is to me an important question. How they decide that, but is important. But where it's decided and by whom it's decided is equally important. Part of the brilliance of the American system of government is that, and not just the American system of government, any government of separated powers, and checks and balances is that we can play on the motives of the actors within those institutions and then somehow direct competing motives at each other effectively so that we can neutralize the effects of bad motives, I suppose. I don't know, that gets very abstract, but in any case, uh, yeah, I guess I just wanted to talk about the topic of how uh, government can at times exploit crime to generate profit and revenue for itself through the imposition of fines as punishment. I think the military, the prison industrial complex does come into this in the issue of private prisons, and um, there may be some uh, the problem is somewhat bigger there, and the whole issue becomes less tedious to think about. We're just thinking about how we impose fines. It seems very small-minded and kind of quotidian. But if I've used that word correctly, but if we but extending that same issue, right? Extending that same question to the issue of private prisons, it may be a somewhat more interesting problem. Um, how the state exploits crime to generate revenue in that sense is it builds the facilities it builds the facilities that would incarcerate individuals who end up being convicted, and those facilities, the more bodies, the more individuals and persons who end up being incarcerated in those facilities allows forces the facilities to expand. And then I'm trying to think of it from a chicken and egg perspective, where it starts and then where it ends up. So um, Hegel had the notion that, or Hegel, sorry, had the notion that the analogy of the plant and how it starts as a seed and then it gradually, the whole thing is a process, and the whole problem becomes a process of starting at a certain point and then having a very um, I suppose not complex isn't the right word, but it's a complex process by which the whole thing manifests. It starts at specific loci that we have to very clearly delineate. In any case, um, uh, so in any case, yeah, with the private prison problem, these facilities they expand, and as the greater numbers of incarcerees requires expansion of the infrastructure of the carceral systems and the prison systems. And as the needs of these systems expand, the government then has a justification for um, increasing revenue to supply for those carceral systems, to supply for the prisons, and to supply for all of their needs. In the sense, they would have the interest in packing those prisons with as many bodies as possible to create deterrence, to create the perception that if you legally err in some way, this could be you too, right? A convict, just like any of the others. So that the more people that we incarcerate, the stronger the deterrent effect that the threat of imprisonment creates. And so that's not only does the expansion of these carceral systems, these prison systems, benefit the interest in deterrence against crimes that could be punished with incarceration, but by creating the perception that similarly erring individuals were incarcerated for the crimes they committed. And the psychological process of deterrence is one of recognizing that a punishment applied to one implies that uh, punishment applied to another, right? The psychological process of deterrence is one of recognition, where punishment is applied to another, and in the process, one recognizes that the same punishment, given the same act, would apply to me equivalently, and that is that's where deterrence comes from psychologically, and that's why there's an interest in expanding carceral populations, and in enforcing more hyper-punitive forms of punishment for crime to create the, I guess, the fear-based perceptions which attempts at creating deterrence play upon, to get people from acting in ways that we've both deemed socially disadvantageous and legally disadvantageous, in the sense that certain acts, or we don't need to go into the specific process by which we label certain acts illegal and others legal. Regardless, the expansion of these prison populations is needed in a sense and so bias again inserts itself into now even into the courts, because the courts recognize that for law to have validity, we have to create deterrence against violations of the law, and to do that, we have to we have to apply punishment so that people recognize that if they act in a similar manner, that punishment would similarly be inflicted upon them. And that's how deterrence works. And in any case, there is that interest in expanding the prison population, because the larger that population, the greater deterrence effects it exerts upon the collective. In any case, right, and the more that these systems expand, the more justification the government has for requesting making essentially revenue requests or budgetary requests that more funds be devoted to these systems, these carceral systems, to preserve and to facilitate the growth of those systems, which the interest in deterrence requires. So in a way, our interest in creating deterrence against certain acts can bias us in some way in inflicting punishment, so I suppose. Right, right. So there's a conflict between our principles and concerns with negative externalities, right? We can apply this punishment to this particular crime, but we, right, and this seems proportional. However, we also have to create deterrence against this crime. So in that sense, that interest in deterrence itself becomes a reason to inflict what is inherently a harsher penalty than may be logically warranted in principle. So there's a tension, I suppose, between the interest in deterrence and the interest in proportional punishment. In any case, regardless of what psychology is operating behind the scenes, it's only to make a simple statement about how at times the state can very easily exploit crime to generate revenue. And there's so much bias and conflicts of interest there. It makes me worry generally about whether punishments end up truly being proportional to the crime, which is an idealistic way of thinking that punishment should be apportioned to the crime. So ultimately, yeah, I mean, we think about whether the application of punishment to any given case is, I mean, state force in principle, right? The application of state force to an individual is not something to be taken lightly. And that if it's taken too lightly, people can become objectified. And so the application of state force and the force of punishment needs to be restrained by a deliberative process of trying to at least attempting to impartially determine what is what punishment makes sense for the given case. And I believe that, theoretically speaking, to begin at the beginning, this tension between proportionality, the principles of proportionality and the principles of deterrence, end up skewing or stretching the form of punishment that we impose, and causing us, so that basic impulse, right, at the core of the whole system, there's something fundamentally wrong with the way that we're thinking about punishment, leading, right, inherently to the application of punishment for the sake of deterrence and not for the sake of justice. So application of state force needs to be restrained by, and it can only be restrained by, a deliberative process of considering, I'd say, I'm spitballing. So, maybe principles of proportionality, that's a principle. So, yeah, it has to be constrained. The process of applying state force to an individual in the form of punishment has to be constrained by principles, one of which is proportionality. I don't regard the utilitarian I don't regard deterrence, which is not a principle. It's a utilitarian concept. And I think that in some ways, the interest in creating deterrence can completely malign the way that we inflict punishment and the punishments that we choose to inflict in any given situation. So it's the tension between the principle of proportionality in punishment and the interest in deterrence. These two interests conflict with each other. And that leads to the infliction of punishment that is inherently via the essential logic of the way that these systems think and administer their services and their judgments and apply the law, and at the same time try to seek justice. At the very core of that thinking is a bug. So the program being run there it seems that there is some sort of bug there. And at the same time, we look at punishment and the application of state force in the form of punishment is very much a battling out of of a principle and an interest, right? An ethical principle and a utilitarian interest. That principle being one, the principle of proportionality and the infliction of state force in the form of punishment on an individual in any given case. The ethical principle of proportionality in the way that we deal with punishment. comes into conflict, direct conflict, with the utilitarian interest in creating deterrence. And so inherently the punishments inflicted are not proportional, violating that ethical principle. So that's all I'm saying. But in any case, the way that the state can use its interest in deterrence to exploit crime, to inflict punishments that are not proportional to the crime necessarily. If we could even divine, well, I think that we can get at what would be proportional. I think that we can ultimately, in the context of a given case and with a given crime, define what proportionality means and what that might be. But the interest in deterrence to keep others from committing the same crime is some sort of bug. It's more or less a distraction, because a proportional punishment would do to create deterrence in the first place. So in any case, but how particularly the state can exploit crime to generate revenue in the form of the imposition of fines is very interesting to me, and how fine levels are impartially decided must be done by must be done by the courts independently, because they're the if it's done by any other branch of government, any other at any other point in that system, there is too much bias. And so it's the solution then to ensure that the government cannot exploit crime merely to generate revenue and profit for itself is to ensure that the courts are ensuring that the fine levels are graduated to the level that we have deterrent utility and nowhere beyond that point. Yeah. So. In any case, that's all I wanted to talk about. Thank you for watching.